CDC data shows over 93,000 people died of a drug overdose in 2020, the highest yearly total on record, and a majority of those deaths involved opioids.
This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. I actually want to start tonight with something that's flown under the radar, but had huge, sweeping implications for a decades-long crisis. I'm talking about the bankruptcy settlement for Purdue Pharma, owned by the Sackler family. A judge ruled that in addition to a fine of $4.5 billion, the Sackler family would be granted complete immunity from opioid lawsuits in the future. There's a lot to unpack about what that actually means, so let's start with how the Sacklers got here. The family is notoriously private and protective of their image, but even if you're not sure who they are, you may have at least seen their name. The family is one of the wealthiest in the world, and they are famous patrons of the arts. Their names could be found in galleries like the Smithsonian, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Guggenheim. Here's what's most relevant. The Sackler family ran the now bankrupt pharmaceutical company Purdue, famous for its OxyContin medication. The family made much of their fortune in selling OxyContin, an opioid painkiller in the same chemical family as heroin. You can see their sales goals skyrocketing over this time. Purdue became infamous for aggressively distributing the drug, which many cite as one of the major factors that led to the opioid epidemic we still face today. After tens of thousands of Americans died from those opioids, one question still remains. Who can we actually hold responsible for this? In 2004, it was the doctors in the hot seat. Prosecutors brought criminal charges against physicians for prescribing massive amounts of OxyContin. Purdue became nervous for its blockbuster drug and donated to think tanks with well-placed experts who published media pieces saying law enforcement was overzealous. The doctors were just doing their jobs. In 2007, it was the Purdue executives. The company pled guilty to the criminal misdemeanor of misbranding, in other words, downplaying the risks of OxyContin addiction and failing to warn the doctors they sold to. Court documents from 2007 obtained by ProPublica show Purdue's head of sales telling the family, "We are well aware of the view held by many physicians that oxycodone, the active ingredient in OxyContin, is weaker than morphine. I do not plan to do anything about that." Richard Sackler said, "I agree with you." The company paid a fine of $600 million, and 3 executives paid individual fines totaling $34.5 million. Over the next decade, it was the pill mills. States began cracking down on pain clinics, selling doses of the drug, and prescriptions became scarce. The damage was done though. This led to cheaper opioids like heroin and fentanyl only growing in popularity. And there was an explosion in public demands for holding the Sacklers accountable, not just Purdue. A tsunami of lawsuits started coming in, and the Sackler name was removed from the institutions they once donated to. One heated email conversation in the family obtained by U.S. attorneys shows David Sackler asking, "What do you think is going on in all these courtrooms right now? We're rich for how long? Until which suits get through to the family?" By the time Purdue had filed for bankruptcy in 2019, it was being sued by nearly every state in the country and thousands of other claimants. And yet holding the Sacklers accountable themselves had been next to impossible. The bankruptcy agreement protects the family from all opioid-related civil charges, and prosecutors have said realistically, criminal charges could be difficult to prove. The government has yet to press a single criminal charge against the Sacklers. Bankruptcy settlements can give a company protection from lawsuits since the company works to restructure its debts. What's odd about this ruling is that this protection was given to the individual owners, not the company. The owners haven't even declared bankruptcy. So who will face accountability for the opioid epidemic, the one still killing over 60,000 people a year? This case has led some members of Congress to introduce a bill, the Sackler Act, to prevent bad actors from evading responsibility through bankruptcy proceedings. While that might prevent future cases like this, it still leaves us without a clear guilty party here in the eyes of the court. The Sackler family remains one of the richest in the world, and they've never been charged and continue to deny responsibility for the epidemic. Of course, many of the families impacted by the epidemic do not feel like justice has been fully served. On the other hand, supporters of this settlement argue funding for healthcare and drug treatment is ultimately better than dragging out the expensive court cases. They see this as the best outcome possible in the shortest amount of time. After all, this epidemic has been ongoing and getting worse during the pandemic. Newsy's Stephanie Liebergen tells us more.
We're in the midst of a crisis, and we're very concerned about it.
America's opioid crisis started long before 2020, but COVID-19 exacerbated the problem.
The pandemic had a big impact because, as you know, people were closed, institutions were closed or working remotely or working at 20, 50, 30% of their capacity.
CDC data shows over 93,000 people died of a drug overdose in 2020, the highest yearly total on record, and a majority of those deaths involved opioids. One of the states hit the hardest was Vermont, and that's where Jesse Bunch works as the executive director of the Turning Point Center in Chittenden County, a peer recovery organization in Burlington.
People are waiting a long time for mental health counseling. We're seeing an increase not only in overdoses, but in individuals going to the emergency departments in the state. And, it's a situation where the problem has gotten bigger and the resources have declined, and that's what we're struggling with.
Before the pandemic, opioid deaths in Vermont actually had been trending down, but the state saw a nearly 40% increase in fatal drug overdoses in 2020, most of them involving opioids. And some of the worst months coincided with the early days of the pandemic and stay-at-home orders.
And that's left a lot of people on the streets and struggling, and not able to get into help.
Data from the first 5 months of 2021 shows opioid-related deaths in Vermont have continued to rise.
We're seeing people coming in here every day really struggling with substance use disorder and mental health issues, and we're trying to get them into the services that they need, but we're finding that often those services simply are not yet available again.
State officials recognize the need to do more. In June, they launched the No OD campaign, aimed at helping people make safer choices and increasing awareness about opioid overdose symptoms. Stephanie Liebergen, Newsy, Washington.
Here to talk with us a little bit more about that story is Newsy's Stephanie Liebergen, new friend of ITL. Stephanie, we talked a little bit about oxycodone earlier, but what are some of the other drugs that have been perpetuating this crisis?
The CDC kind of tracks this in 3 different waves that have all led to the opioid crisis that we're dealing today. And they really point it back, starting back in about 1999 with the prescription drug overdose issue. Now that continued for a little over a decade, and it wasn't until 2010 that the CDC had what they call the second wave, and that was when heroin overdoses really started to rise. Then about 3 years later, that's when you had the synthetic opioids really coming into play. That's where you're talking about your fentanyl, one that we hear a lot about that's incredibly dangerous. Just a small amount of fentanyl can be deadly, and drug dealers will, cut fentanyl into cocaine or meth or some other drug. So these drug users are not even necessarily aware that they're taking something as dangerous as fentanyl, where just a small amount could kill them. And all of those things combined have really brought us to the crisis as we're dealing with it today.
And we understand that this crisis has, even gotten worse during the pandemic. I mean, one of the things that we've learned through your reporting and through additional reporting is that a lot of those in-person resources had to be cut back during the pandemic and rerouted to virtual resources. What are some of the ways that folks have been trying to address this epidemic during the pandemic?
Well, you're absolutely right. In-person services especially, took a big hit during the pandemic. Now, Vermont, the state that I was focusing on, actually started a statewide resource. They call it Vermont Help Link. They launched that in March of 2020, so just as the pandemic was getting underway. Really a free, confidential resource with a bunch of information about recovery services or harm reduction efforts. Vermont has a number of programs that they're doing in their state to try to combat the opioid crisis that are also happening across the country. So there are 42 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico, that all have syringe exchange programs that are, allow, drug users to switch out those syringes to stay safer in that manner. And that's something that Vermont's really focused on, is reducing that harm. So that's those safe, syringe exchange programs. Also, even just an awareness and education campaign, honestly encouraging people, if they're going to use drugs, don't do it alone. Have someone else with you, so that way you have someone with you who would maybe recognize the symptoms of an overdose and be able to help with something like naloxone if needed. And now that's another thing Vermont's doing, and across the country, states are trying to make access to Narcan, the naloxone, trying to make access to that much, much easier. There are even, efforts to put boxes, like we have fire extinguishers and defibrillators that'll just be, in a box on the wall in, buildings and public places. They're trying to do that same thing with naloxone to make it easy for people to access, to not keep it behind a pharmacy desk and, requiring a prescription.
Yeah, so even though those in-person resources had to be scaled back, there's still a number of ways that folks have been trying to address this crisis, as we've learned from your reporting. Stephanie Liebrigan, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to do it again sometime. When you're back, we're going to take a closer look at how some native tribes are working to treat addiction through less conventional methods.
We take a step away from the noise and spin to really hear the stories that need to be told. Newsy cuts through